And today we are talking about a series from what has been one of my favorite manga authors, or a group of authors, which is Clamp. We're talking about Magic Knight Rayearth, which somewhat recently got a really nice Blu-ray release from Discotech. You can get the whole series in one package, well, minus the OAVs, but we'll talk about that.
Oh, yes.
That's fine.
Oh, yes.
Yes, it's called the Memorial Collection, not the Complete Collection.
Yes.
We'll talk about why Memorial might be the best adjective.
Right. So, back in the 90s, like, when I was younger and, like, getting into anime, I mean, I feel like Clamp was one of the big things, right? They were huge. I don't know if it's quite the same. I mean, certainly they still have a lot of popular series, but it's been a little while since Reservoir Chronicles, Tsubasa Reservoir Chronicles is, been past a few years. I don't know if Holick's still running, but even if it is, it's kind of not like a big thing anymore.
Yeah, a lot of the stuff they were doing was kind of references to their older work.
Yeah, and I mean, there's, I guess, like the new Cardcaptor Sakura.
Right, but even that was like a good 5 years ago. It's been half a decade of that.
Yeah.
And so when I think of Clamp as a group, they are very, like, to me, sort of fundamentally married to the 90s. I feel like that's when their definitive works came out. My personal favorite things of theirs came out. I think they were sort of at their peaks.
I think there's kind of a dividing line too, because like they sort of switched in terms of who like the lead artist was. And so like you can see there's a shift in their artwork. And I think that their artwork after that point is also still very good, but to me, the aesthetic that they had in the 90s that's the definitive thing. And I feel like after that, they still did really nice work, but for me, it was not quite as arresting.
I think it's funny that you mentioned that because 2001 was when Angelic Layer came out. And Angelic Layer for me was the one where they would say, this is a Clamp show. And I'm like, really? This is a Clamp show?
Yeah.
Like, this doesn't look anything like Clamp. It doesn't feel like Clamp. It's like, that was, I think, for me, Angelic Layer was the turning point. They went from being like this very cool, very like distinctive style where it's felt like there was a conscious effort to make their style more commercial and easier to draw, and I don't know.
I mean, easy to draw is sort of like
that was kind of the turning point.
Operative like phrase here, right? Because when we think about Clamp,
because I mean, obviously they were popular before, so I don't know about that, but easier to draw definitely because their style is really elaborate, and so it's definitely something that was difficult to translate.
Right, like you need an entire bottle of paint just for like the eyes of a given Clamp character in the art style that I'm thinking about. And the thing is that whenever I personally think of Clamp, I kind of think of them in the same way as I would think of certain American comic book creators, such as, say, Jim Lee or Todd McFarlane, also like big time 90s artists. And let's be honest here, all three of them, I think, are far more known for excelling in drawing than in writing. And that's not to say that Clamp is bad writers or that even certain issues of Spawn or what have you are bad. It's just, when you think of what are they're like the grandmasters of doing, it's drawing stuff. And I think Magic Knight Rayearth in particular is sort of like the one that was like popular among basically everybody who were anime fans around the time it came out, which would have been like early mid 90s.
Yeah.
This was an example of something that you could tell they thought of it and was like, hey, how do we make something that girls like and guys also like, and it's not like an incidental thing the way Sailor Moon, wow, a bunch of guys like Sailor Moon because they're horny. and so that's sort of where, like, when I think of Clamp, this is the first series that I think about as like their thing, even though it's probably more appropriate to think of something like maybe a Tokyo Babylon or an X or something of that.
I think for me it's always X and Tokyo Babylon, but this is definitely up there. It is interesting though, because to think about the idea of like it being a crossover thing, because I can get why it would be, but at the same time, like, it doesn't feel that different from some of their other stuff to where it feels like they're, trying to appeal to that other audience. But then again, like, there's a lot of Clamp's big influences that are shonen series. They were hugely influenced by Devilman and JoJo's Bizarre Adventure.
No shit.
So,
well, you got to remember when I was 14 in the 90s, the access to Clamp was like anime things. And what was the anime stuff from Clamp around then? Well, there was like one OAV of Rig Veda and one like two-part thing at Tokyo Babylon. That was about it. Rayearth was kind of the first
I
thing that we saw.
I think Rayearth ran in Mixzine, right?
By the time it started in Mixzine, like I'd already seen like the show through like fan subs and what have you.
Oh, okay.
But yes, it did run in Mixzine alongside Sailor Moon, and so certainly a lot of people saw it. But by the time, like, I was excited for Mixzine to come out because it's like, oh, I'm gonna finally see not just the Sailor Moon manga, but Rayearth. Like, we knew about it.
I think X had already been coming out from Viz at that point, because I want to say, was that the first one that started coming out in the US?
X, the manga?
Yeah, as like X 1999.
I know that it ran in America.
That seemed like that was a decade later. Like, in my mind, like X didn't start until the 2000s in English.
Yeah, and so Viz was coming out with some of the stuff like X, and then Tokyo Pop had a lot of the other stuff like Rayearth, and then later Cardcaptor Sakura. So, but I think Rayearth was the only one that ran in Mixzine.
So do you want to get those people who have never heard a single thing about Rayearth, what the hell are these people talking about, get them caught up?
I mean, really, like, it's the dreaded isekai, right?
It was before we knew what that term was as an otaku subgenre. Right. It was around that time when it was novel as a concept to have people transported to another fantasy world. On their quest to get home.
It's interesting to think because, you know, now, like, we talk about isekai is so prevalent and, like, there's so many isekai series that it kind of feels like a 2020s or late 2010s thing. But no, I mean, they've been doing isekai series from the beginning. And, you know, in the 90s, this was one of them. There was, like, there was Fushigi Yugi. I think they were more like shoujo.
That's correct. I think that's what
maybe.
We sort of mentioned this in previous episodes where we said there was a fundamental difference between things like Yoko, Fantastic Adventure, Lita. Or, you know, Lita, Fantastic Adventure, Yoko. I always get those, you know, names mixed up. But, like, between things like that, things like Magic Knight Rayearth, Escaflowne, Fushigi Yugi, they were very frequently at that time, almost predominantly, I would say, women-centric as far as, like, who the lead characters were. Even El Hazard, it's a guy who's the main character, but he has to spend the majority of it in disguise as a woman. A lot of these things, like, there's a fundamental difference because the overarching goal is to get home. And in the quest to do that, you grow as a person through things that you go through, and then you return back a changed sort of person, you know, very much like, say, a Labyrinth or, you know, what have you, like that kind of story. And that's a fundamental disconnect between that and the modern isekai show, which is not about personal growth really at all. It's about, okay, I was a loser here, but now I'm cool in the alternate world.
So Rayearth is a series about three girls, Hikaru, Umi, and Fu, who are on school trips to Tokyo Tower and get transported to this magical world called Sephiroth. And basically they show up there and they are quickly told that they have been summoned there for a specific purpose, that they are supposed to help save the world.
私は同志クレフ。お前たちを導くために来た。お前たちは元の世界には戻れん。このセフィールを救うまではな。
Because the Princess Emerald, who is the pillar of Sephiroth, is in trouble.
エメロード姫のおられた頃のセフィールはこうではなかった。人や精霊、聖獣たちが仲良く幸せに暮らしていた。ところが、神官ザガートがエメロード姫を捕らえたから、セフィールは一変した。
And basically, the idea of the pillar is that there is, like, Sephiroth is a a magical like fantasy land, and one of the things that they talk about is that like will is like the most powerful thing. It's like Green Lantern universe, right? You know, the willpower is like the key. If you don't know, in Green Lantern, the thing about the Green Lantern powers is that it's like powered by
the willpower of the wielder, right? So this is a whole world where willpower affects the state of things, and so they have a pillar,
right,
who is like, you know, their job is to, you know, exert their willpower and maintain the peace.
Right, the one with the strongest heart and the strongest will. And so, yes, and like that's their entire duty in life, is to keep the world stable.
But like the evil wizard, the evil high priest has taken the pillar away. And so now the world is starting to
Zagato,
you know, suffer because monsters are starting to roam about, and, you know, people are starting to experience fear, etc., etc.
召喚された異世界の者たちはまだ子供だ。魔神が蘇ることはない。しかし今、同志クレフのもとに
Right, and so the pillar is able to summon people from another world to be the legendary Magic Knights and to save Sephiroth. And just to not spoil right away, I will just say that a big part of the series is that all gets kind of undercut. Like there's things that they don't know. And so while it is true that their job is to save Sephiroth, there's a lot of things that you don't know and that they don't know going into it. And so it's actually a little more complicated than things sound.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where this was like, I don't know if it was definitely sponsored by Sega. Undeniably, like, this was a thing.
Right. They had a Dreamcast game.
Saturn Games precedes the Dreamcast by several years.
Oh, yeah, Saturn.
And so the sort of nature of the world of Sephiroth is very much like a JRPG.
Which they say in the series, like, oh, it's like a video game.
Yeah, it was like a groundbreaking thing. Right, a groundbreaking thing to be like this sort of self-aware. It's like my, you know, Japanese video games, whereas nowadays there's like 50 shows like that, right?
Right.
And so what was groundbreaking, you know, in 1993, 1994 is maybe like very derivative now, but, you know, it was unlike anything we'd seen before at the time. And even right now, as of a couple of weeks ago, there was a brand new video game that just came out called Super Robot Wars 30, and the cast of Magic Knight Rayearth is in the video game.
Yes.
And there's a like sort of a funny like fourth wall breaking sort of dialogue exchange where Fu points out, you know, it looks like a lot of people are getting transported to other worlds recently, not just us. And it's like, and then Umi says, you know, you're talking about anime and light novels, aren't you? And she's like, yep, guilty as charged. And it's like, well, you know, you know, if you're perhaps playing this video game and, you know, we're also trapped in the video, etc. There's like, you know, little parts in those video games where they kind of like make a lot of inside jokes. Yeah. And so,
well, as you note, the video game is Super Robot Wars, so I should note that like the Magic Knights eventually get giant robots. That is, you know, the final thing.
And that was something that got a lot of people's eye, I think.
Right, as a girl series with giant robots.
Right, because that's a very uncommon
you mentioned
thing.
Escaflowne.
Right. You didn't see a whole lot of that, and even, like, it was for, like, sort of this sort of short window of time, because you almost don't really see it a lot very much now, either.
Yeah, I was about to say, even now, you don't really. I mean, I think what you see is that there's obviously a lot of women like giant robot shows for guys, but it's true, you don't see that many, like, shoujo series that have giant robots.
No, not as many that are clearly like targeted.
Yeah, so it's still pretty distinctive. I think even today.
Yeah. Do you think that this series is Clamp's like most world famous show?
Maybe?
Because this show got everywhere.
It's possible. I mean, they've had a lot of big hits because Cardcaptor Sakura was big and this was big, and
maybe it's Cardcaptor Sakura, but I think this is probably the other
I mean, there's
contender.
French dubs of.
Je m'appelle Omi Ryuzaki. Je suis en 4e. Moi, c'est Fuuji. Je suis aussi en 4e. Hikaru Shido. 14 ans. Je suis en 4e. Ah! Tu es en train de me dire que tu as le même âge que moi?
There's Spanish dubs of this.
Tengo que participar en una competencia de esgrima la próxima semana. ¿Quién será responsable por todo esto?
Oigan, presentémonos.
Debes estar bromeando.
There's like a lot of like, international.
Mokona, che fai?
Basta, Mokona, siamo stanche di inseguirti. Dove hai intenzione di portarci questa volta?
Like, this got
I mean, I
out
know,
there
like, I
internationally.
think here more people know Cardcaptor Sakura because that ran on television, and I don't think that the anime for this ran on TV.
No, Magic Knight Rayearth never ran on U.S. television.
Right, but Cardcaptor Sakura did, so that's, I mean, so Sakura is bigger here. Might be Sakura, but definitely this one was released a lot of different places, including America, so yeah, I mean, it's gotta be one of their biggest.
All of Latin America, so yeah.
I feel like a lot of people, like when this was airing in the mid-90s, a lot of anime fans, whether you were a guy or a girl, you were excited to see Sailor Moon. You were excited to then see Magic Knight Rayearth as well.
Yeah.
And so this was something that I would have been watching like at the same time as like Yu Yu Hakusho and, you know, whatever kind of stuff was out at the time. Because it was just like we need to get whatever it was that we could get, we would watch it. Like there wasn't enough anime out there that you would pick and choose and be like, oh,
Right.
you know, we're not really watching this. But like this was never really a thing where people didn't like it, because there's just the elements of between the artwork, like everyone is beautiful because it's Clamp, gorgeous ladies, attractive guys, the magic element because they have to go on the quests to sort of get their
fantasy,
swords
but
and
also with giant
spells.
robots.
Yeah, and then eventually, you know, you get the robots. And so there's sort of like a lot of things that everybody liked in this.
Yeah.
Coupled with the actual pacing of the story, I really enjoy the first series of Magic Knight Rayearth in particular, because there was so much sense of forward momentum.
Yeah.
And that was another thing that was novel for us at the time, because you
Now,
didn't
do you
really
mean the
see
manga or the anime?
the anime, because I didn't
Okay.
see the manga until many years later.
Right, because I think one of the things that's interesting about Rayearth is the manga is actually quite short. The entire first series is only 3 volumes, and then they did a second series, which is also 3 volumes. And so I actually think that, like, this is a series that really benefited from adaptation. I mean, I love the manga, and there's things about the manga that I like better than the TV series, but, like, there is no breathing room in that manga because it's only 3 volumes. Like, shit is just constantly happening. And so being stretched out into a TV series actually gives it, like, way more space for, like, character development and a variation in, like, the pacing. Yeah, and so I think overall, like, the first series is well paced.
Yeah, because it's not just we haven't even mentioned the other aspect that is the key to the Rayearth merchandising empire, which is that this was like, you know, when people would get in the argument of like the great anime mascots, the Magic Knight Rayearth was kind of like in the top contention, because this is like the time when it's like Tenchi Muyo is coming out and people are talking about Ryo-Oki, and then there's like Luna and Sailor Moon and things like that. But Rayearth has a character named Mokona, who it's, as it turns out, is named after like the pen name from one of the members of Clamp.
Yes,
who
Mokona
calls themselves Mokona. Right. And Mokona is like an egg, but a rabbit.
Yes.
And, you know,
It's such
big,
a good
fluffy
design, because I think, you know, a lot of times, and you see this, I think, with a lot of like the Sanrio designs, or at least like you used to, not so much in some things like Show by Rock, but like is kind of like the simplicity of it. Like Hello Kitty is like a very sort of simple design. Like Mokona is sort of like pinnacle of that. Like it's such a simple design. Like you said, like it's basically like an egg with like long ears and feet, but it's so distinctive at the same time.
Like, I don't know if their intent was to design Mokona for merchandising. It certainly worked out for them.
I'm sure they thought about it. I mean, they're fangirls.
Mokona plushies were all over the place, and it's a very easy thing to make.
And then there was like they made the little song that's like the Mokona song for how to draw Mokona, and you know.
卵にバナナが2つまん丸お池に三日月が2つゆりかご2つに枕も2つかわいいあんのはあれもこな
A lot of earworms in that sense. Because, again, that's the other thing about Rayearth that kind of caught everyone's eyes. Like, production value-wise, it's like it was such an intimidating thing to be like, credibly adapt Clamp's manga artwork
for a
television.
TV series.
And I mean,
yeah,
you're going to be hard pressed to find people who say like it didn't do a good job at it. It's one of those things like, say, the 90s X-Men cartoon where they use that Jim Lee character designs from the comics to say like, yeah, that's what we're going to do. And, that's a very tall order to put into television animation. And yet people remember that fondly as like, oh, wow, they really pulled it off. In the case of Clamp, it's similarly difficult, but they've got a bonus trick up their sleeves that unfortunately you couldn't really do with Jim Lee, which is in cases where there might be a little too much motion, you can always turn them into cute chibi-fied versions of themselves and run around.
Which they do in the manga a lot,
I would have liked to see a cute chibi-fied Storm and Wolverine, doing things, but it was not to be.
I love that first season, and I think that anime in general is much better than American animators are at giving the illusion of motion when there isn't any. And so they can have a still image and just put like speed lines across it and then zoom in on it, and then that's like a person flying towards you with a sword.
Right. And some people will say that that's cheap and they don't like it, but I think it is effective.
I don't think that this show looks any worse animation-wise than any other TV show at the time it was coming out. I think it looks...
No, I don't think so.
I don't think it stands out as being particularly cheap-looking. I think it's just... I think what actually stands out is that the animation, that the artwork is so elaborate.
Yeah.
That you are consciously now thinking about these characters moving more, and like these poor animators that had to like animate this. So
this was the first TV series directed by the infamous Toshihiro Hirano, who
I love him
is
so much.
like perhaps one of the most dangerous men in the anime industry.
Such a weird thing to think about that
you look at
this is a Hirano.
You look at the rest of Hirano's resume before and after. Magic Knight Rayearth just does not seem...
One of these things is not like the
it's
others.
like, it's like, well, I worked on Super Dimensional Fortress Macross, Do You Remember Love? And I worked on Megazone 2-3, and I made Ixer. That's my biggest...
Ixer.
Everyone knows I made Ixer and Dangaio, and
now I do Baki.
Nowadays, today, he's doing Baki on Netflix. But then, like, before that, it's like Apocalypse Zero and Devilman Lady and, Zeo Rhymer and, all this kind of, like, really crazy OAV stuff. And then Magic Knight Rayearth. And it's like,
right.
I see.
But maybe he was the only one crazy
enough
to do it.
The only one insane enough, apparently, who didn't realize, like, the impossibility of the task that was being handed to him. And so he was, like, saying, like, oh, yeah, I didn't even get to meet Clamp until after I was basically done with the first series.
だから原作者とお会いするのも初めてな形だったんですけどね。ただいろいろその問題というかあれがあってそれに最初にお会いをしなかったんですよ。でその辺がちょっといろいろ紆余曲折ありまして、第2部という形に途中からなると思うんですけども、その前にやっとそのお会いしてお話できて。
And so hopefully it worked out all right.
Well, they did a second series.
Yeah, so because again, this show was a pretty big hit, and so also just like in manga, it was a surprise hit because guys were buying the manga in Japan because hey, wow, there's robots in this. Who'd have thought? So whether it was the publisher, which I think it was Nakayoshi, like Kodansha's branch, they were like, keep this going. And then similarly, please make more anime. And the answer each time was, yeah, we kind of did not expect to need to make another series of this because we concluded everything.
But honestly, I think the twist at the end sets up to where, like, I feel like the second series, both in the manga and the anime, makes sense in that way.
Yes.
Like, we're not satisfied with this and we're still, like, kind of caught up on
it.
It feels to me very much like they were on, like, episode 20, and then they were told, by the way, you're going to have to do another 20-some episodes after this,
another
right?
30,
Or,
but,
30-some episodes
like,
after this first season. And then they're like, shit, okay, let's put in some justification to get a
Well, I
second
mean, but this
season.
is stuff that's in the manga.
it's all in the original
which
source
was only
material.
3 volumes.
And so
that doesn't make any sense from that perspective.
And so in the interviews with Clamp, they said, hey, we didn't realize there was ever going to need to be a sequel. This was originally going to be the ending.
Right.
And so then it was just the
So,
editors came to us and like very much like what happens with Dragon Ball or with Thissa North Star or something. They're like, all right, that's the end of the story. I've got editors come in and say, we need you to keep this going because it's selling too well. And they're like, well, excuse me for a moment. And then you scramble to have something and it kind of shows. And so I think at this point we can probably sort of put up like a bit of a spoiler flag warning for this show that is, well over 30 years old or something like that. No, maybe 25 years, because one of the things that just blew people away back then, and I would argue even still to this day, like this is still like an incredible development.
The ending
is the conclusion, the final few episodes of what was originally going to be the original ending of this series. Because you said earlier, Clarissa, that they were on their quest, but they didn't really know the full details of it.
Part of what the series is doing is looking at this question of like, okay, so you have this entire world that's built around the concept of one person, right? That's responsible for upholding it. But that's now their entire life. What happens with that? And so the 3 girls are specifically not told the whole thing.
Right. They're just told you've got to go on your quest and get more powerful. And, then you'll be able to defeat the evil wizard and his underlings.
Right. The thing is Emerald did summon the Magic Knights to save Sephiroth, but the thing is that she summoned the Magic Knights to save Sephiroth by killing her, because the problem is that she fell in love, and so she's not capable of dedicating all of her focus to upholding the stability of the world. Like, she can't selflessly give herself entirely to Sephiroth because she has this kind of selfish, as she says, desire to have this relationship with someone.
And the person she has a relationship with is Zagato. Who turns out he's not actually a particularly evil wizard high priest. He fell in love with her and he rejected the notion that she has to do this. And so he was like, all right, well, just forget about that and come be with me. And that's why the world is sort of falling apart. And she's sort of realizing, all right, well, this is wrong, but nobody in the kingdom has the power to kill the pillar.
柱はただこの世界の安定と幸せのみを祈り続けなければならない。なのに私はザガートを神官であるあの人を愛してしまった。
And so that's why she has to bring people from another world, another reality, because they're the only ones who would have the power to do this. And of course, the Magic Knights, they don't know this. And so they're beating down the minions and stuff like that who are like, fiercely devoted to Zagato and, whatever, because they think like, oh, this guy is a tyrant and he wants to overthrow everything.
He kidnapped her.
And that's not actually the case. And so that's like a fascinating sort of twist that you haven't really seen in a lot of these stories before. Because now it's like there's no cut and dry morality of this. Now this is like pretty wild stuff where it's like the real problem is not like these people, but the system that exists in place around it. Like at a societal level. And how do you stab or punch or fireball a societal level problem? You can't.
Right. And that's why I think it actually works to go back and have that second story, because like, yes, the story is concluded, but at the same time, like now you just have this world that no longer has a pillar and you still have this system. Like even if they replace the pillar, you still have this kind of shitty system. And like Zagato is not the only person that's like the system is kind of shitty, as we, see when we go back. And even in the manga, I think this comes through more in the manga than in the anime. Even like Clef is like I hate this. Is this even the right thing? Like, is this system right? Is it right for me to help Emerald do this? There's this like a real ambivalence about this system, because on the one hand, Sephiroth is this sort of like perfect place, right? Everything's peaceful and prosperous, there's no war, there's no like significant danger, like everything's great. But that's only the case as long as you have this one person that's sort of freedom
basically is
sacrificed. And so I think that's why the story concludes, but there is something left. Like, there's some questions and some issues left that they can go back to, which I think works.
Yeah, I mean, conceptually, I'm not opposed to the idea of there being a continuation.
Right.
The trouble
and some
is...
of the problems with the second one were exacerbated by changes they made in the anime.
Right. And that's
Like
sort of one of those
Pressia.
things. Yeah, Pressia is an issue that, like, they obviously were not prepared for because,
Right.
you know...
They killed a character who didn't die in the manga.
食べ物とても美味しかったヒカルありがとうあの飴なら確かもう一個あるどうしクレフこれでよかったのですね
Right, that was a huge thing, like, because again, it's the mid 90s, you know, you're used to watching freaking Mighty Max or whatever the hell's on TV, and then you're watching Rayearth, and it's like their friend is killed, and it's not like she's killed in like a super dramatic fashion. She's like killed by like rubble falling on her, and they can't save her with their magic or anything like that, and then they have to like bury her and move on. And it's like, wow, this is insane that, you know, because by the standards of like cartoons, you know, you're watching stuff that's on American television at the time. And this is like nothing you've ever seen before. And then when you get to that ending where it's like, and now there's no way out of this. They have to kill the princess who they've been spending all this time trying to rescue because by killing Zagato, you've now killed the person that she loves, and now she's enraged and what have you. And there's only like a sliver of her humanity who's like, you need to kill me now. And they're forced to it. And then bam, just like that, they're instantaneously sent back home.
Congratulations, you're home now.
Right. You made it. Your quest is complete. You know,
but the thing is
Final
like
Fantasy
in the
fanfare.
manga, Pressia didn't die, and so when they did the second series in the manga, okay, Pressia is there. Well, now in the anime, okay, well, we killed Pressia, but she's supposed to still be there.
久しぶりねヒカルプレセアプレセアプレセアヒカル本当にプレセアなの嘘じゃないよね
Yeah, you do the 1984 thing and just rewrite history.
Yeah, because,
sort of.
Before they figured out the better solution, that's exactly what they did. They did a flashback to footage of her dying from the first series, but they altered the animation so that instead of her dying and them having to actually bury a physical body, she like faded away. And so then they said, oh, well, you know, before Princess Emerald died, her final wish was to resurrect everyone who was killed in the battle. And hey, I'm back again, everyone, Bambi 2 style.
And that's what they say, although again, like that's not actually what happened.
That they have about 20 episodes to figure out. Here's a less bullshit response because I'm sure people were writing in saying like bullshit, you know. And so then they write a better answer than that. Yeah. But it's very clear that that is sort of symptomatic of one of the issues with the second series. Because again, the first series is 20 episodes long. Continuous movement, continuous advancement in plot. Every episode, they're either introducing a character or getting a new ability or getting
going somewhere
new location that is like a tangible set of progress. And that's 20 episodes.
Yeah, I think the second series overall like has a lot more issues, and some of that is just because like they deviate a lot more from the manga.
They deviate
in the
a lot
second
more
series.
From this in the second series compared to the first, and they also have to do 29 episodes of story.
Right.
And like you said, the original manga was 3 volumes and the sequel manga was also 3 volumes. So the first time they did 3 volumes worth of story and about 20 episodes that they expanded it out to. Well, now this time they're taking 3 volumes and expanding it out to 29.
And it feels like it.
It feels very decompressed.
I think there's still a lot there that's crammed into those 3 volumes, but they decide to add a lot of stuff more so than they did in the first season. And like, there's just stuff that like there's some stuff I don't understand. Like the whole thing, like, you know, speaking of Mokina, like there's a whole huge thing at the end of the second series in the manga with Mokina.
That is not in the anime.
Yeah, they just took that out entirely.
And yet everybody knew it like through osmosis, like, oh, I heard, like, kind of like, my uncle works at Nintendo, like, oh, I heard that, this is what happens with Mokina. And it turns out that is in fact true. But like the general premise of the second series is that for some reason, like everyone has gone back to regular life, but they're just bothered by the fact that they went on a trip to Wonderland and, they've come back and
they're traumatized.
And they're traumatized by the fact that they had to murder a lady, maybe not some of the other things like the horrible monsters and things like that, but just the whole ordeal has certainly changed them as the traditional isekai parallel world storyline would have done. And so they reconvene, and then they each sort of confide in one another that, I really wish I could go back there and do something, make things right. And then something happens and they're transported back to Sephiroth, but it's completely different from how they remembered it because there is no more pillar.
And Clef is like, how did you get here? Nobody
I didn't summon you, only the pillar has the ability and there's no pillar.
And so there is no pillar, so everything's gone to shit.
Yeah, everything like is now like this sort of like, skies are blackened, like most of the surrounding
monsters
countryside
everywhere
is wrecked.
Like literally the world is crumbling.
Right. And now in one of those sort of going from Frieza to Cell sort of narrative changes, they reveal that, oh, by the way, Sephiroth's not actually the world. Sephiroth is just this one part of the world, sort of a country, and now there's neighboring countries who want to take over Sephiroth. Yeah. And so it's not like Sephiroth was like this fantasy
weird. They're
world.
sort of like planets, but they call them like countries.
Yeah.
セフィーロの外にある3つの国だ。オートザム、シゼータ、そしてファーレン。
Exactly.
Yeah, I don't know.
And no mention of this anywhere in the first season at all. You could have just believed that Sephiroth was the entire world.
There's not really any need
to mention them, right?
It.
But at the same
time,
time,
you would have
I'm sure
that
it's not something. It's probably not something they planned. But at the same time, like, there's no reason that it would come up.
Right.
Well, what I'm saying is that kind of screams of shit. We got to come up with something.
Yeah, because it does. It now makes it seem like Sephiroth's a bunch of weirdos, as opposed to this is a realm where this is the world that it is. Because as it turns out, there are 3 neighboring, we'll call them countries, that have now sensed that there is a power vacuum due to the lack of a pillar being present in Sephiroth, and so they are now going to invade Sephiroth.
Well, in the manga, they talk about it as like before there's literally no way that they could get to Sephiroth because it's protected by the pillar.
Right. She prevents any incursion.
Yeah.
Right.
So a literal opening that they can actually go there. So it's like a weird thing. They talk about like pathways. So it seems like sort of like a kind of like an interdimensional type of thing.
Like a spelljammer warp, sort of thing.
I mean, the way it's depicted, it just seems like it's,
in the anime, it just looks
flying,
like, you
flying
get
to
on
like Africa
it looks like you get on a
or...
plane and take a jet, right?
Yeah.
Right.
It's just so weird that suddenly, like, oh, Sephiroth's not the world? Sephiroth's just one place of many?
Right. It's
like,
okay.
So...
I mean, like, yes, it's obviously something that they weren't necessarily planning and that they had to add on.
California recall election, and now a bunch of people from out of town are coming in to run for governor, for lack of a better term.
Yeah.
But, the 3 nations are each like very different from Sephiroth. The first and foremost one is called Autozam, and they are the opposite of what Sephiroth is all about. Like Sephiroth is a fantasy land of magic, and Autozam is a technology sort of area where they use just like regular like high-tech like giant robots and laser beams and stuff like that. And I feel like these guys in the manga, they're like the primary antagonist of the second series of the manga. They are not that in the anime because they decided, okay, we're going to create a brand new primary antagonist. And I actually personally like the anime's primary antagonist a little more than I like Autozam because
I like Nova. I think Nova's kind of interesting. I don't really feel like Debonair
that's basically what I'm getting at.
Like...
私はノバ光を殺すもの
She
Yeah.
just exists. But like Nova is an interesting idea because you can tell that Toshihiro Hirano is all about Nova because in the interviews he kind of confesses we needed an original villain, and so I just kind of drew Ixer 1 and it's just literally Ixer 1 is the villain.
これはまあ原作クランプさんとねそのアニメなりの新しいキャラがいた方が面白いんじゃないかということで、出したキャラクターでしたけどもねまあ私の作品ご覧になっていただいていると分かると思うんですけども最初に「戦1」というシリーズがビデオシリーズがあってこれに非常にそのなんていうんですかねリスペクトしたような形で出てるキャラクターなんですよこのノバーとかいうその敵側のキャラクターはね割とこの格好も似てますし
But the characters all keep saying she looks exactly like Hikaru. She looks nothing like Hikaru.
Nothing.
Right.
No.
I think
Hikaru
the
does not
idea
have
is that like
giant
maybe her
elf
face is
ears.
supposed to look like her, and like
Right.
she's supposed to like sort of feel like Hikaru, like they have the
Yeah,
same like spiritual
psionically,
presence.
Yeah,
But
that's
it's
sort of
so
the idea.
it's the way that they say it. It just reads terribly because they just say like, "Oh, she looks like Hikaru," when it's like clearly
It's
they
like,
look
bitch, I
completely
can look.
different.
They don't even look remotely similar. And so
No.
it's just funny. I think that to me, like my main problem is AutoZam is very like reserved. Like the characters in it are generally
Yes.
not as bombastic as the characters in the first series. Like, you know, there's
Right.
different, like there's Alcyone, who's like an ice witch, and she's like an evil, horrible person because she's over 30 in a shoujo comic. And she's got the boobs to prove it. And so, this is a horrible person. And then, you know, Ascot is a little kid who summons a bunch of monsters and he's like kind of an annoying little brat. Caldina is from Osaka or has like that sort of voice of like Osaka, but she's like dressed very slutty and she's a dancer.
Well, she's actually
illusionist.
from one of the countries in the
Yeah,
second series.
it turns out in
but-
the second series they reveal that she was actually from one of these other places, but they didn't know that at the time.
Sure.
And then Lafarga is this sort of like direct swordsman sort of guy. And so all these characters are very like larger than life and bombastic. And everyone in AutoZam, by contrast, is kind of just a guy. There's the person who's like, well, I'm a mechanic and I am a person who's the helmsman.
Mm-hmm.
And the leader, Eagle Vision, he's kind of a reserved sort of character. Like you don't really know.
Well, I mean, he aligns with Lantis, right? Who's one of the
Right.
people from Sephiroth.
One of the new characters,
right? Who's
introduced in the
Zagato's
second
brother,
series.
and who's introduced.
It's the very Gundam style. Like, here's
Yes.
my brother who has the exact same voice as me.
Yeah.
あの声確かどこかで聞いた覚えがある
聞いているはずだ。あのランティスは神官ザガートの弟だからな。
弟ザガートのうちも最初びっくりしたんよあのザガートにそっくりの声なんやもん
And looks exactly the same as me, but his hair is a little bit different.
Right.
So that's Lantis versus Zagato. You know, it's one of those things like, what do we do? What about if Rao had a secret brother?
Yes.
It's also, you know, looks like Rao. And then the other reason I
Which
think
is also what
AutoZam
they
is-
did with Pressy.
Yeah, it's also what they did with Pressia, by the way. Spoilers. The other reason I'm sort of biased against AutoZam is that the other nations, I feel,
Are ridiculous.
do have characters that are similarly ridiculous and like
Yes.
seemingly fitting in the world of Magic
They're
Knight
kind of
Rayearth.
comic relief.
Right. So there's Faren, which is basically China. And so, you know, they've got like a little empress who's like a
With the Ojo
precocious
Sama
brat.
laugh.
So yeah, I mean, that's a second faction, like you mentioned, Faren. And then the third one, Chizeta, which is basically India.
Yes.
You know, there's two sisters, Tatra and Tarta, and they are constant. Like one of them is very like sweet, and one of them is like very like loudmouth and bickering. And like these are like funny characters, and because their rationale is, well, we want to, you know, it's very much like Frieza in the Broly movie, where it's like, well, I need to collect the Dragon Balls so I can make myself taller, but not that much taller. Make maybe like 5 centimeters, so that people think I'm naturally growing. It's not like, you know, so it's like Chizeta, they want to get control of Sephiroth because their country is tiny and they want to make it a little bit bigger.
Yes.
Not like that much bigger, but a little bit, you know.
And AutoZam is actually like the only one that has like a real reason, which they Did they go into it in the anime? Because I know in the manga
Not
they talk about
really.
the fact that their world is polluted, and so like literally their world is going to be uninhabitable shortly.
Yeah,
like ours.
They didn't
Yes.
really spend a lot of time talking about that in the anime.
Okay, I
It may
didn't
have come up
remember
in
them
like a
really
sentence,
going into that.
but it was more clear cut in the manga. Why exactly are they invading Sephiroth? It's just kind of like, sort of like, hey, here we are.
Now, Eagle has other reasons relating to the fact that he's in love with Lantis, but
You know, that's revealed, like, I would say 20 episodes into this 29
Yes.
episode arc.
武器は全部取り上げられてしまいましたか。バレちゃいましたね。
And that's like, I think my major issue with the second series is that you go from that pacing in the first series to a much, much slower pacing
Right.
of information being dealt out. It ends up being a lot of information gets reiterated, that you can go through a whole
Yeah.
series of like 4 episodes and summarize it in like a sentence, maybe 2.
yeah.
I was going to say that I feel like, and I know that this is an unpopular opinion, but I feel like if you took the bullet points from this second season and maybe got rid of a few characters or a few events, this should have been a movie.
No, that's not that unpopular an opinion at all.
Yeah, I mean it's a
don't-
3-volume manga like the first one, so yeah, I mean you could certainly do that. I mean I think
Okay.
that like the first season, there's a lot packed into those 3 volumes, but I think they just probably didn't, especially because you talked about in the first season, the Magic Knights are traveling all over Sephiroth to like, they've got to retrieve this, and then they've got to find the 3 rune gods, which are the giant robots, and they've got to like awaken them and take possession of them, and then they can go to rescue the princess. So they're kind of traveling all over the place. Whereas the second season is like all of these other people are coming into Sephiroth, so like it's a more
And they're in a
stationary.
static location. And that's when you start running into issues as far as like, wait, how much time has elapsed between this and this? Or like, how did they get from point A to here when they were just here? You start running into like some sort of basic logical conundrums of, hey, aren't we being like bombarded by this ship that's like
Right.
50 feet away or whatever? And it's like, oh no, well, we're just going to leave. Like, it ends up becoming sort of like this almost brain-powered-esque.
Yeah, for whatever reason, the pacing just, they couldn't quite manage it. And I don't know how much of that was also because of the stuff they added in, but for some reason, they just couldn't quite get the pacing the way that they did in
And
the
it's
first
odd because
season.
the lady who wrote the manga also wrote the entire second season. Clamp wrote this themselves.
Yeah.
Right. So this isn't so we can't blame like Clamp for like, oh, they just wrecked Clamp's work. Like, no, this is Clamp's official work. They actually wrote the second season. So
Right. Still, obviously, Hirano's still directing, but yes, I mean, Clamp was
Yeah,
involved.
and again, like,
yeah, heavily involved. They are.
Yeah.
What other series can you think of where the manga writers wrote the TV series? Not many. Very, very few are they that closely involved. And so it's not like we can blame any one person for this. This is Clamp's heavy involvement. And yeah, so much of it feels like, what the hell do we do? Like, we have got 29 episodes to fill. What the hell do we do? So,
Yeah.
Because a huge amount of the series is Hikaru like moping around like the castle and not doing anything. As you said, Daryl, like information is repeated to us over and over and over again. And yeah, like I said, the bullet points of this are very short. You can sum up all of the bullet points in this season in like
and
5
I
bullet
don't
points or
actually
something.
dislike what those bullet points are. Like, if you say like, okay, these things happen,
No, I don't.
like that, okay, that's part of the story is fine.
Yeah.
It's just getting there. There are a lot of times in that second series where it's like, it was kind of hard to get through it just because not a lot of forward momentum is happening. The actual story is if you were to like summarize like a synopsis of like what happens, oh yeah, this is pretty good. I don't have a problem with it.
Yeah.
I mean,
like as far as
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I prefer the manga overall, but although, like I said, I do think Nova is a really interesting addition.
Yeah, we can talk about Nova, I think.
Look, crazy lesbians are always a good
Well,
addition.
certainly, I know that's your angle, but like the out that Clarissa was mentioning to say, like, okay, here's a rationale to have a second series. The creation of Nova is something that wasn't even in the manga, and yet I feel like that's like the justification for the second series to happen, which is that they hold this Hikaru especially, I mean, you know, Umi and Fu don't give a fuck. They're perfectly fine. But you know, Hikaru
Right.
has this very unresolved trauma from what she had to do to, you know, resolve matters in the first series.
Yeah.
And so because Sephiroth is a land of will, you know, at the moment of that happening, she sort of like splintered off a whole other persona, and that's Nova. And that's why Nova has the spiritual identical nature as being Hikaru. When she's taunting Hikaru and saying, I am you, I'm everything that you hate, you know, everything. It's like she's speaking in literal truth, we find out, because
Right.
she's like created from the will of Hikaru to, you know, hey, this is not what I wanted. And so that negative sentiment, the only way to confront that is actually to, you know, and it's an interesting like thematic thing to be like, okay, I can't beat Nova by brute force, beating her with a sword or whatever.
Right.
Like the only thing I can do is come to grips with what I've had to do and, you know, accept myself.
Yeah, I have to accept my guilt and grief and all of this
And
stuff.
so that's why I feel like, you know, as a primary antagonist, Nova is far more interesting than Eagle, because Eagle's motive is, okay, I want to become the pillar because then I will be able to save Autozam, even though we have been told you won't be able to care for Autozam because you have to spend all your time caring for Sephiroth. He's like, okay, whatever, I don't care. It's a whole big plot point of like only one person may enter the room where the crown is that lets you become the pillar, and anything else is
Right.
like destroyed instantaneously. And only when you attain the power of the pillar are you able to exert your power over Sephiroth. That's like the one of these things has been repeated. Like when we say a lot of things are repeated, that is something that is repeated quite a bit. The resolution to this story is like, we forgot that was the point. Because
like,
it turns
what
out,
the hell?
no, we don't really need to bother with, you know, this whole thing. We can just sort of like declare we don't need this anymore, and then it's fine.
That's like one of the biggest cases where I think it suffers from the fact that they took all of that stuff with Mokina out of the second season, because in the manga, that whole thing with Mokina plays into and it makes sense
Right.
why that's happening and like how that actually resolves. Versus where in the series it's just like, oh well,
Right.
we're just
And
going to
it's
do
like,
this.
Therefore,
So something-
Yeah.
like
so-
making the whole 29 episode of warfare for this thing pointless because we're just doing this anyway. Whereas
Yes.
in the manga, as it turns out, and this was something that people like knew through rumor and whatever, we hadn't been able to see the manga, but it's like,
Right.
yes, it turns out.
Yeah, it turns out Mokina is God.
Literally God this whole time, and he's just been fucking with the Magic Knights this whole time. And the reason why he just vanishes whenever there's like monsters or thereabouts is because he just doesn't feel like it, I guess. Or, you know, he's a cute, cuddly. He's like, oh, I can't be mad at that cute face smoking it, even though you're literally God and responsible for our, you know, daily trials and tribulations.
Right.
But man, so fluffy.
Well, so the other thing is also, like, not only is he God and he created, like, Sephiroth and the other lands, like, Mokina also created Earth.
That's right.
Like, he's also the god of, like, the world that the Magic Knights come from, our world.
Right. Don't tell the Christian fundamentalists that Magic Knight Rayearth is actually against scripture.
Yes. And so, like, the idea is that Mokina created Earth first and is like, man, this shit sucks. Everybody's, like, going to war. The world is falling apart. All of this horrible stuff is happening. So then Mokina creates Sephiroth, where, like, this one person can just make everything perfect.
And unfortunately, I think maybe Hirano said, you know what? It's going to be too hard to have that speech be delivered in the anime because all Mokina can say is, "Pa-pa, pa-pa." And then the subtitles will be like, the planet Earth is too corrupted by sin.
Now, something that I was confused by, and maybe you guys can clear it up, was something that kind of confused me, was the world of Sephiroth is falling apart because their pillar is gone. But
Right.
we're also told over and over again that the world is falling apart because the people are sad.
When the pillar is there, the pillar is like that one overriding will. So like their will is so strong that it overrides everyone else.
So
without a pillar, all of
Then the
the
uncertainties
different
of all the people-
willpowers and emotions of all of the people are pulling things in all of these different directions and are having much more of an impact, where when the pillar is there, even if a bunch of people are like upset or sad, that gets overridden by the pillar.
It's like the warp in Warhammer 40,000.
Because it's the way that the second season talks about it, it's basically comes down, it seems like it comes down to, if people were just happier, none of this would be happening.
Well, sort of, but that's only because the pillar is absent.
If people weren't afraid, then the monsters would disappear. However, there's no pillar, and that's what.
So if we could do the Care Bear stare,
and that's what they,
which
the
seems
Care
to
Bear
literally
stare is
happen.
kind of how they get their way out of it. As a matter of fact.
Yeah. I mean, theoretically, like, they've never run Sephiroth without a pillar, right? So, like, theoretically, if everybody's happy, but, like, I mean, especially in the absence of a pillar, so, like, the pillar was what kept Sephiroth, for example, protected from all of these other places. The pillar kept everything out. The pillar kept everything stable and perfect. So, it's like with Earth, if you don't have that pillar, good luck getting everybody to, like, be happy and be nice to one another and make everything wonderful.
I mean, it seems like it makes it a bit messy for me, but I guess like that's how they fixed the show in the end, was people are just happy and the world is okay then.
In the series, kinda.
I'm only talking about the series, yeah.
Yeah.
That's all I can refer to. And yeah, because it frustrated me hugely, because part of it was just like, okay, your world is falling apart because you're sad, so...
Why not just not have depression? Checkmate, liberals. And then...
Well, I'm not gonna say like that, but okay, it seems like that's a never-ending spiral of the world is crappy because we're sad, and we're sad because the world is crappy.
Right, but again, this is because the pillar is not there. If there was a pillar...
It wouldn't matter if, that was the case, because, again, the Great Lantern of Oa is just gonna, keep things in order. But as much as, that's frustrating, at the start of this episode, I was talking about the Netflix misguided attempt at the Cowboy Bebop series. And so...
Are we going here? We're going
here. It's time to go.
Let's do it. Let's go.
Because
I want to talk about this. This is the most fascinating thing I've ever seen.
There is something else that is more... I always said before we were watching this, as Gerald was like saying like, oh man, the second series is rough. I was always saying, you know what, Gerald? I can't fully hate the second season because... there is something else. There's another. And I don't dislike the second series that badly, but I recognize that it's too long.
Yeah.
That it needs to be like, a third shorter or half as long or movie length, whatever, some amount shorter than 29 episodes. But at least I like ultimately where those characters and storylines sort of goes. And so I always said there's one more thing of Magic Knight Rayearth anime that exists, and it is not part of Discotheque sets. It's not why the Discotheque set is called the Memorial Collection, not the complete collection, because it does not include the 3-part Rayearth OVAs, which I was like, I tried to pitch this to Jared and Clarissa, who I think neither you'd ever seen it before. Is that correct?
No, I'd never seen it.
No, I had not actually seen the OVAs. I never had a copy of it.
Okay, so here's flashback to 97, 98 or whatever it was, where I was giving you that background of like, okay, I'm watching Rayearth, and then Mixine comes out, and then I go to the video store and I see a tape that just says Rayearth on it, and it's got like this cool sort of box cover where everyone looks a little older. In my mind, I'm thinking this is Rayearth the movie. This is like a sequel. I had no idea what it was, so I rented it and watched it, and I was like, oh, okay. So I set this up by saying, imagine if Netflix got the rights to make a Rayearth Netflix series. This is what you would get. And I didn't really like elaborate further, but I just was like trying to like calibrate your expectations, because the Rayearth OVA is this curiosity.
It's fascinating to me. It's absolutely fascinating.
It's made by the same people. It's still directed by Hirano. It's got the same voice actors. It's the same animation studio, but they're like, we're going to write this without Clamp. And we're going to tell the story of Rayearth in 3 episodes.
But we're not going to do any of that.
We're not going to do any of that, really, because we're not actually going to tell the story of Rayearth. And the characters that we're going to show you are not really recognizably the same characters that you've seen in Rayearth for these last 49 episodes. They're just going to be people who look similar and have the same names. Because it turns out it may cost a little too much money if you were Netflix to say, hey, Cowboy Bebop is like set in this like future where you got to go between all these different planets. Can you like cut the price of that down? Well, like the same executives would hand the people a note when making the OVA where it's like, you know what? Having these girls get transported to this fantasy world of Saphira, that's a little much. How about if we have people invade Earth instead. And so that's what happens in Rayearth is the denizens of Sephiroth invade Tokyo. But Tokyo, there's a problem. It's a major metropolitan area. And so don't worry, we will cast a special magic spell that removes all people on planet Earth. So, except for our heroes, and that way we don't have to draw a lot of extras anymore. And so in this version of the OVAs, one, it's like there's like stripped of color. Like the original series is very colorful, like Hikaru's all red and Umi is blue.
Yeah, it's so
and Fu's
muted.
green.
It's like the Zack Snyder version.
It's the Fox, Zack Snyder style. Like we're just going to have everyone dressed in black, and then it's going to be set at
Desaturate
night.
everything.
Right. It's also set at night the entire time, pretty much. And the invaders, by the way, you know, some of the people who are good are now evil in this, and the backgrounds of Hikaru, Uri, and Fu are now different.
They now know each
Now they all
other.
go to the same school, and they know each other, and they're friends, and they're mad that they're about to graduate middle school and whatever. And even though it's 3 episodes, and each episode is like 45 minutes long, fucking nothing happens in this cartoon.
It's absolutely one of the most fascinating.
It's so weird.
It's one of the most fascinating things I've ever seen in anime, and I really mean that because this is something that I cannot figure out who this was made for. If you're a fan of Rayearth, none of these characters are recognizable. None of this is relatable in any way. And usually you take a couple of approaches with this. Maybe you take the approach of the Ranma half OAVs, where they said, okay, we have a couple more stories to tell. We're just going to tell them in an OAV. Or you take the approach of, we're going to retell the same story in a faster, maybe make it look nicer. Like, the Fist of the North Star movie, for example, like retold like some stories from that. They don't do that either. Or we got this OAV format, you can do things you can't do in that. We're going to make it more violent or something. They don't do that either. So this is
it's very
a fascinating thing. It means
it's not even Magic Knight Rayearth. It's just Rayearth, because this version of the story, there is no them getting armor and getting weapons or whatever. This is just you embrace your fursona, because now it's no longer robots. Now they just turn into giant furries and fights.
Yeah, there's no Sephiroth.
And maybe there's an audience for that, but yeah, there's no like...
Sephiroth's just referred to, like, you see, I think, a quick few shots of it, and it's just referred to as, like, this place they came from.
And that's the other thing. If you just watch only this without having seen Rayearth, it makes no sense.
No.
Because
Like,
there's not really any real exposition or introduction of characters.
That's what makes it so fascinating, because if you don't know Rayearth, these characters mean nothing.
And it makes no sense.
And if you do know Rayearth, you're just annoyed that it's like, oh, in this version of the story, these characters don't know each other, and yet you feel bad that you just had to murder them.
Right.
Or not murder them, as the case may be.
Right. You have no relationship with any of these people, and they will say these, like, big names, and you're expected to, like, react to this, and it's like, okay, who is this person if I haven't seen this show, if I don't know these characters? Absolutely fascinating why this was made.
Like,
and
the
who this
closest I would
is
try
for.
to compare it to would be something like the Escaflowne movie. But even the Escaflowne movie was like, the problem with that was like, you're trying to tell too much in too little time and without condensing down the story. And so a bunch of people just
and
show
at least
up
it
and
looks
leave.
great.
And it looks incredible. Yeah, I'll give you that. This doesn't look incredible, and you're not utilizing your time, in a way that respects the audience. And so it's just one of those things where Manga Video released this in the US, and it's funny because when you look at the extras and you look at the bios of the characters, you can tell Manga Video didn't give a fuck, because they just copy pasted the bios of the characters from the show and put it into this, and now it's like this biography has no bearing whatsoever to how this character is in this anime that you're releasing here on this disc. Because like Eagle Vision comes from the land of Autozam, and he's got special gear on his equipment that's not in this cartoon.
I thought we got this officially before we got the TV series.
That's almost guaranteed to be correct.
Yeah, we only got the TV series in early 2000s, and I think we got this in the 90s.
It's possible that it might have preceded it by like 2 or 3 years, but you're right. Media Blasters finally released Rayearth on DVD in the 2000s. That's when they dubbed the whole thing into English and like re-sang the songs and stuff like that.
Yeah, back when they used to do that.
Right. And so I believe it was also a simultaneous like not simultaneous, but I mean, they also had a VHS release.
Yeah, they wanted it on TV, but I think those
They
female...
were trying to get on TV.
Those female character designs were probably too sexy for any TV in America for children, so...
Plus, it's a little difficult to edit the show down to still tell the story. Like, even Cardcaptor was heavily edited, and the objectionable content in Rayearth, by comparison, would have been exponentially higher. And so they were not unable to get a TV deal for that, which is unfortunate because...
Well, and like you said, it's
for girls.
It's like primarily a girl series, but it also has stuff for boys, and so like I don't think the American networks know how to sell
No,
that.
they don't. And it's just like with Cardcaptor, they had to re-edit it to make it seem like Shalaran was like the main character or the co-lead.
Right.
There's no doing that with any male character in Rayearth. It's like, you know, Fario shows up a little while for a couple of instances, but he's never the main character or anything like that. And so you can't really like get around that.
Yeah.
And so TV executives, they're always very hesitant to be like, oh, I'm not putting on some show it's an action cartoon for girls. That's not the demographic
male
we're going
characters,
after.
There aren't any.
Yeah.
Even to this day, there's that struggle with certain shows like that of like, you know, who's going to greenlight it.
Yeah.
And so that's why even now you don't really see shows like Magic Knight Rayearth getting made, at least as far as children's things. But this was a show that aired in Japan in prime time, golden time as they call it. And so there's high expectations for ratings. It did not quite live up to those high expectations. And so
あれだけこう毎週毎週テレビ局に行って視聴率のことを言われると思わなかったですから、だからその以降深夜とかね BS 行っちゃうんで僕はあんまり視聴率とかね言われたことないんですけど、とにかくゴールデンっていうのは全然違いますよね。まず視聴率を取らなくちゃいけないと。でこっちの方でテレビ局のプロデューサーが2桁いかないんで。
My only hypothesis for how does this OAV exist, just because when you look at the staff of who it is, it's almost like the people who made the anime were like, hey, this is our take on this. Unfortunately, your take on it is absolute shit. And so I think this is a contributing factor as to why Toshihiro Hirano was locked up in anime prison for decades. It's like after the Rayearth OAVs and Apocalypse Zero and, you know, Devilman Lady and, you know, all this stuff, they were like, no more Hirano. You have to be sealed away. And then Netflix came along, some executive.
Go to horny jail, Hirano.
Yeah, and some executive was like, man, I sure love cranking it to Zeo Rhymer back in the day. Let's get that guy to do Baki. Where is he? It's like, well, actually, he's locked up under a bunker next to Akira in the cryo sleep area. And then it's like, you know, the beginning of Trauma Team where it's like there's the forbidden surgeon who's in a straitjacket because his powers of doing surgery is just too much. And they let him go and he starts doing surgery. It's like now it's Hirano making Baki.
Oh, I was thinking like Demolition Man where they just like unfreeze him.
Well, yeah, because you have to like send a maniac to catch a maniac.
Yeah.
Yes.
So,
yeah,
it's like, well, they've allowed Hitagaki to make anime now. And so who's the only one who can contain this? It's you, Hirano.
The thing is, for completion's sake, I would have liked to have seen this as part of the Magic Knight Rayearth set, because I don't like stuff just not being available.
Was it like a rights thing as to why it's not in the discotheque set?
It is a rights thing.
Okay.
It is a separate license because they were asked about it. And I think whatever, like manga video stuff is weird as far as like being able to reacquire that stuff. You know, it was difficult enough to get Giant Robo and so on, but at least for the Rayearth release, it is pretty much as good a release as you're going to see as far as the video quality, as far as the extras. There's a lot of really good stuff on there. Like they got all the cutscenes for the Saturn game, both the dub of that was done back in the day by Working Designs. And so they put those on the disc. And yeah, there's interviews with Hirano and a bunch of people like that. The old extras from the Media Blasters release are carried over. It's a really good release.
Yeah.
And it's one of those things where it's a good thing you have this podcast, because otherwise it's like you buy this thing and it sits on your shelf for years. And it's like, I need an excuse to rewatch Magic Knight Rayearth, and here it is.
And for the manga, Kodansha came out with a really beautiful hardcover set. It's like a boxed hardcover set. And each one comes with a art book. It's larger sized, so, you know, Clamp's artwork is super detailed, so you can see that in a larger size than any of the other editions of the manga that came out. Definitely would recommend that one if you are super into it. If not, there are other editions I think that you can get.
Plus, they've made it available digitally as well. well. So, I mean, you know, this is pretty widely available in 2021. Like, Rayearth is, again, like we said, one of the crown jewels of the collection. And so it's maybe harder to find some of their other works, but at the very least, this is pretty easy to get, whether you want to watch the anime or read the manga.
I definitely recommend both the manga version and the anime adaptation. I mean, even for all the issues discussed with the second season, I still think overall it's worth watching.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I don't think you'd find anyone anywhere who'd say don't watch at the very least the first 20 episodes. And I think everyone would say, yeah, that first 20 episodes is kind of like almost an example of like a perfect show. You know, it's got some issues with it, you know, as far as little bits of jankiness or whatever, but like very few people are going to speak ill of that. The second series, it's a little more divisive. I'm not going to say it sucks, but, you know, I've said my piece on it. But it's a good bookend to it.
Yeah.
And then the manga is different enough that I think that, you know, you'd like it a little more. Like, again, I actually like the anime personally a little more than the manga, just because a lot of my favorite characters get a little more time in the anime. Like Alcyone, for example, she's killed like pretty quickly in the manga, whereas she's there for the long haul in the show, even though they kind of don't know what to do with her after, you know, the first series.
I mean, we talked about Game of Thrones earlier, and this isn't like that last season of Game of Thrones. Like, I think that second season, I feel like you could almost put like a definitive list of episodes to watch out of that second season. Watch these episodes, skip these. I wouldn't know what those are offhand, but I don't think that the second season is unwatchable. It's just slow.
Yeah, I think there's enough there that's still good, that's worth watching.
And then Rayearth, man, that's real bad. It's
the OAV's Rayearth. Yeah, no. I would say I can't recommend anybody go and track down the Rayearth OAVs.
No.
I don't. There's no redeeming value to it, really. It's more just
the only reason would be for completionism.
I just forced them to watch that because I was like, this is the time that I have to
when else are we ever going to talk about Rayearth other than now? And so out of completion's sake, I'm glad we watched it, but it's a fascinating thing. Like, it's pleases no one, does nothing.
And that one's kind of hard to find by comparison. Like, you'd only ever find those OVAs if you looked pretty hard for it. You're not going to accidentally stumble across that or readily get it the way you'd get the TV series or the manga.
Yeah, it feels like a missed opportunity that we didn't get like an awesome Rayearth movie. An awesome like 90-minute, 2-hour, either maybe retell the first season.
Yeah.
Or do what it should have been, which is the second season instead of like the TV series. It's a shame we didn't get something awesome like that.
Yeah, I think this is before compilation movies started to be so much more common. I mean, we certainly had them, like obviously like Gundam is a good example, but I feel like it's before they started doing compilation movies for like
I think it was also that this became like an international success, and a movie doesn't make as much money necessarily as getting like 30 episodes or 50 some episodes licensed for international run.
I mean, you'd still think they would milk it.
Yeah, that we didn't get a movie at the end. That's a shame. So
yeah, well, at the very least, like Rayearth is not old enough that can be in the old people's video games, because in Super Robot Wars T, that was like the first time where it's like, oh, and we're adding Magic Knight Rayearth into this video game where, you know, they're going to interact with like the Get a Robo team and what have you. And so like in Super Robot Wars 30, like they're back at it again to have Rayearth. And so I've been seeing like some multiple fan arts lately of the cast of Rayearth dressed up or done up like the Get a Robo team.
It's very funny. It's great. Good, yes. I've been seeing those too. They are exceptional, and weirdly it works.
Right. Hikaru is totally Ryoma. down to knowing, the martial arts.
And how do we know
Umi is Hayato and Fu is not really fat, but she's got a big, thick sword.
And how do we know that Clamp, being the weird perverts that they are, weren't watching Getter Robo and weren't
watching Getter Robo and thinking,
what if they were girls?
Why don't we do our Getter Robo?
Yeah.
Certainly, the ultimate form of Rayearth is that they combine.
Yes. And also, Rayearth is so interesting to watch now because the first time I watched this, I did not watch this in fan subs. I watched this in the Media Blasters release. But even then, this sort of look for TV series was not uncommon. Now this is something that you never see. Like the style and the design work is, if you are only used to like modern anime, this will look very different from anything that you've seen. Gigantic shoulder pads and the extremely detailed characters.
Well, I mean, Clamp has a really distinctive visual
Yeah, they did
style.
at this time, and then
particularly in the 90s.
Yeah, and then after Angelic Lair, they just put that all to shit, and now they're just kind of very generic. But yeah, at this time they were really neat, really distinctive. So, and this and X are kind of the height of that. So yeah, I absolutely definitely check this show out.
Oh man, X, that's one that did get a gorgeous movie, but it's a mess.
I want that on Blu-ray. I want that
and yet
piece
I
of
want
shit
that movie
on Blu-ray.
on
I want that. I want a 4K copy of that pile of fucking shit that is one of the worst
all of
fucking movies ever
on
made.
High def. I want it in UHD.
Yeah.
And
that garbage fucking movie. We should all get together and watch that piece of fucking shit and just marvel.
Well, the thing is the TV series is another one.
I don't feel that heated about it.
I don't hate it as badly just because Yoshiaki Kawachiri was like, sure, I'll do X, the TV series. And then, that TV series is actually quite good. But it's just one of those things where even when that movie came out, everyone was like, you know what, just watch X2, the music video, using footage from it. And that's like the superior X experience. That was our opinion even then when it came out.
Yeah.
I remember when they played that at like an anime club I went to, and as soon as X came on, like half the room left. Like they were just like, the movie has such a bad reputation. Maybe one day we will talk about X.
Maybe.
Yeah, once Clamp finishes the manga.
I feel like I should. It was such a big part of my teenage years. All right, well, is there anything last minute that you guys wanted to...
If you have that Sega Saturn game, I think you can buy a house with it now.
Yeah.
I believe that was one that was announced before the Saturn was released in America and came out once the Saturn was discontinued.
By the time it came out, the Saturn was dead. Yeah.
Yes, that's working designs for you. And I believe there is a D-dub of that game out there, but unfortunately, it's like Japanese language, working designs translation, which is kind of...
Right, it's the undub. Okay, so for those who don't know, like Working Designs was a company in the 90s.
We should explain this.
In late 80s. They would localize Japanese games and RPGs and things like that, most notably Lunar.
And the thing is, to give them credit, they were kind of the only people in town for this. It was like them and a few things that Squaresoft did here and there.
But by and large, they were like, if you wanted them, it's like, oh, buy your Sega CD so you can play Lunar, Silver Star Story or whatever. And the gentleman who ran the company, a guy named Vic Ireland, he was always of the opinion of like kind of the sort of Stephen Foster sort of, who's another like antiquated reference. It's not 15 years out of date because no one knows who Stephen Foster
Carl
is.
Masek is the up-to-date reference. No, wait, that's
right,
20
nowadays,
years out of date.
It's gone full circle, right? But he was always sort of this idea like, oh, I'm going to improve this source material. I'm going to change the mechanics of this game to be better than what it was and make it more palatable. And so the way he would do that is that he would localize things sort of the Family Guy way. He would put in very like then contemporary jokes to be hip and cool. I'm sure Vic Ireland could get work nowadays being a writer for Borderlands.
I think he's still out there. I think he's got another company doing video game localizations. But yeah, that if you find a copy, quote unquote, of the Magic Knight Rayearth game for Saturn, that's kind of what you have to deal with, is their translation of it.
But at the very least, you can watch all the cutscenes.
Yeah, and the cutscenes are available on the Discotheque release, and those I think, if you just leave it as an extra, as a bonus, it's very entertaining. To be like, oh, this is ridiculous, ha ha ha. Once it's not the only way to experience the media, then that ridiculous kind of dub is like, there's got entertainment value to it. And I feel that same way about streamlined stuff and about, whatever, as long as it's not the
It's also quite interesting
because
because there's a lot of stuff in the games that is very different.
Oh, yeah.
In the game that's very different from the show.
The plot is very different in these cutscenes because it's not like a lot of these characters are murdered in the actual show or manga. Whereas for a video game, it's like, well, there's not going to be a sequel to this. this, so let's murder this whole cast at the hands of the Magic Knights. So check it out. Let us know what you think. Did you watch Rayearth? When did you see it? What version did you see? We'd like to hear from you. Our email address is animeworldorder@gmail.com. And you can go to our website, www.animeworldorder.com, and leave a comment on this episode. And we'll be sure, we certainly read all the comments, even if we don't read them out loud in the show. And so we love to hear from you. Let us know what you think, because this was definitely like a formative thing for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah. How firmly is that 90s clamp aesthetic imprinted into your brain?
How many people in hallways did you hit with your massive shoulder pads as you walked down the hallways of anime conventions?
I vote that we bring back the giant shoulders.
The giant shoulders and the capes is like, it's such a striking image. Giant shoulders, cape, sword, standing on robot. What's not to love?
Yeah.